There are films that entertain you, and then there are films that stay with you long after credits roll. Films where every frame feels deliberate, every performance feels lived in, and every creative choice feels like it was made by someone who genuinely cared about what they were putting on screen. Catch Me If You Can is exactly that kind of film. Released in 2002, Steven Spielberg's stylish, sun-drenched caper about the world's most charming con artist became an instant classic, a movie that balanced wit and warmth in equal measure. That gave us one of Leonardo DiCaprio's most effortlessly charismatic performances, and that reminded audiences everywhere why great storytelling never goes out of fashion. But beneath the polished surface of this beloved film lies a far messier, far more fascinating story. One full of last-minute decisions, unexpected revelations, and secrets that have been hiding in plain sight for decades. Most people who love this film think they know it well. They remember the disguises, the forged checks, the cat-and-mouse dynamic between DiCaprio and Tom Hanks, the gorgeous period costumes, and John Williams' irresistibly breezy score. What they don't know is how close the film came to never existing at all. They don't know about the directors who walked away, the actors who were replaced, the performances that were never written into any script, or the uncomfortable questions about whether the whole story was true in the first place. They don't know that Spielberg was making a film about himself as much as he was making a film about Frank Abagnale. And they certainly don't know that the greatest con in the entire story might not be any of the ones depicted on screen. So let's pull back the curtain entirely. Let's talk about what really happened before the cameras rolled, during production, and in the years that followed. 25 secrets, hidden for decades, finally brought into the light where they belong. The story of how this film came to exist is itself almost as improbable as the story it tells. Frank Abagnale's memoir captured Hollywood's imagination almost immediately after publication, but translating that story into a workable screenplay proved to be one of the industry's most stubborn creative challenges. For more than 22 years, the project drifted through Hollywood in a kind of perpetual limbo. Scripts were written, rewritten, and abandoned. Studios expressed enthusiasm and then quietly moved on. And the rights changed hands so many times that keeping track of who actually owned the story at any given moment became a full-time job for entertainment lawyers. This was one of those projects that insiders whispered about the way people whisper about a beautiful old house that nobody can sell. Everyone agrees there's potential, but something always goes wrong before the deal closes. What finally broke the deadlock wasn't a single dramatic moment, but rather a slow accumulation of circumstances. The right timing, the right team, and the arrival of a filmmaker with both the vision and the clout to push past every obstacle that had defeated everyone before him. When Spielberg finally committed, decades of stalled momentum suddenly collapsed into a single burst of productive energy, and a film that had seemed perpetually out of reach was suddenly, almost magically, underway. But before Spielberg arrived, 3 other directors had already tried and failed to get this film made. Each of them came in with genuine enthusiasm, developed their own creative vision for the material, and then departed for reasons ranging from scheduling conflicts to creative differences to the simple reality that a production this unstable is an extremely difficult thing to commit your professional life to. The film had developed a reputation problem, the kind that follows a project around like a bad smell and makes talented people hesitant to risk their time on something that might never actually happen. By the time Spielberg stepped in, the production didn't just need a director. It needed a savior, someone whose name alone could transform a troubled development into a guaranteed green light. That's exactly what happened. Within weeks of Spielberg's commitment, financing locked into place. Studios that had been sitting on the fence suddenly became enthusiastic partners, and a project that had spent 2 decades going nowhere began moving at a pace that left everyone slightly breathless. Even the source material itself came with built-in complications that most biopics never have to navigate. Frank Abagnale had been honest, in his own way, about the fact that his memoir wasn't a strictly factual account. The book's own introduction warned readers that names, places, and certain events had been changed or dramatized for effect. This wasn't a secret that emerged later. It was acknowledged from the very beginning, part of the package that Hollywood had purchased along with the rights. Spielberg understood this clearly and made a deliberate choice that shaped every subsequent creative decision on the project. He wasn't going to make a documentary. He was going to make a movie about a legend, about what a story means emotionally rather than what it records factually. This philosophy gave his team the freedom to invent, compress, and reimagine, to pursue the feeling of truth rather than its literal documentation. Every time facts conflicted with narrative momentum, story won. Every time real events were too small or too complicated to serve the film's emotional needs, Spielberg simplified and amplified. The result is a movie that feels deeply true even in its moments of obvious invention, which is perhaps the highest compliment you can pay to a piece of storytelling. Nowhere is this creative license more evident or more emotionally consequential than in the film's treatment of Frank Abagnale's relationship with his father. Christopher Walken's portrayal of Frank Sr. is one of those performances that seems to expand the longer you think about it. A portrait of a man slowly losing his grip on the life he'd imagined for himself, clinging to pride and affection in equal measure, breaking your heart without ever raising his voice. The scenes between Walken and DiCaprio give the film its emotional spine, the aching, unspoken love between a father and a son who can't quite reach each other across the distance that circumstance has placed between them, the reunion that closes their story, the moment of forgiveness and connection that audiences carry with them long after leaving theater, never actually happened in real life. Frank Abagnale and his father remained estranged. There was no closure, no final conversation, no moment of grace. Spielberg invented all of it, and he did so knowingly, because he understood that the film needed that emotional resolution to justify everything that came before it. Without it, Frank's journey would feel incomplete, his crimes without redemption, his longing without resolution. The fictional reunion is one of the film's most significant departures from reality and simultaneously one of its wisest creative decisions. It gives the story a heart that the facts alone couldn't have provided. And then there's a moment that Walken himself couldn't have planned for even if he'd tried. During one of the film's most emotionally charged scenes, something happened that nobody in that room had anticipated. Walken's character breaks down, genuinely, rawly, in a way that reaches through the screen and grabs you by the chest. And the remarkable thing is that none of it was scripted. The emotion emerged spontaneously, surprising DiCaprio, surprising the crew, and apparently surprising Walken himself. Spielberg recognized immediately that something rare and irreplaceable was happening in front of his cameras, and he did the only sensible thing. He kept rolling. DiCaprio, to his enormous credit, stayed present in the scene and responded authentically to his co-star's unexpected emotional outpouring rather than breaking the moment. That take made it into the final film, and it remains among the most quietly devastating sequences in Spielberg's entire filmography. It's a reminder that the most perfectly crafted productions are still, at their best, containers for human unpredictability, and that the most memorable moments often arrive without warning or invitation. Speaking of things that arrive without much warning, consider what the film did for Amy Adams. Before Catch Me If You Can, she was virtually invisible to Hollywood. Her resume was thin, her profile was low, and she was precisely the kind of unknown that studio casting departments routinely overlook in favor of established names with proven box office appeal. Spielberg saw her audition and chose her anyway, based purely on what she brought into the room, a quality of warmth and genuine vulnerability that made her character, the trusting and sweet-natured Brenda, feel like a real person rather than a plot device. In a film filled with veteran performers and charismatic stars, Adams carved out moments that belonged entirely to her. Her scenes with DiCaprio have an authenticity that grounds the film's more fantastical elements, and her performance as a whole foreshadowed the acclaimed career that was quietly waiting for her on the other side of this opportunity. Spielberg's instinct to cast an unknown didn't just serve the film. It changed the trajectory of one of cinema's most celebrated careers. The preparation that DiCaprio brought to his role was equally remarkable, though it happened mostly out of public view. During production, he arranged a private meeting with the real Frank Abagnale, a quiet, largely unannounced encounter that the actor kept deliberately low profile. His goal wasn't to gather facts or verify biographical details. It was something more elusive and more valuable. He wanted to observe firsthand the quality that had allowed this man to fool so many people for so long. What he found was someone of extraordinary composure and natural authority, a person who moved through conversations with an effortless confidence that made his past exploits suddenly, vividly plausible. DiCaprio studied the way Abagnale established trust, noted the subtle rhythms of his speech and the unhurried certainty of his manner, and brought all of it back to performance in ways that aren't always obvious but are always felt. Small gestures, particular vocal inflections, moments of disarming sincerity. All of it traces back to that private meeting. His dedication to genuine research rather than surface imitation elevated the entire film in ways audiences sense even when they can't articulate exactly why. The costume department performed what can only be described as a logistical miracle in service of that performance. Tracking Frank Abagnale's constant reinvention across pilots, doctors, lawyers, and a dozen other invented identities meant cycling DiCaprio through more than 100 distinct looks over the course of filming. The wardrobe team operated at a relentless pace. Daily fittings, last-minute alterations, constant adjustments to keep up with shooting schedule that rarely slowed down long enough to catch a breath. But the costumes weren't merely aesthetic achievements. Each outfit did narrative work, communicating Frank's current identity instantly and efficiently, allowing audiences to understand who he was pretending to be before he'd spoken a single word. A perfectly cut suit signaled authority. A pilot's uniform commanded automatic respect. The clothes acted alongside DiCaprio, doing half the work of each transformation before he'd opened his mouth. The underlying theme, that identity is performance, and that Frank Abagnale was the most dedicated performer of his era, was embedded into every stitch. The production itself moved with matching restlessness, filming across 147 different locations in just 52 shooting days. The schedule was punishing by any reasonable standard. Constant travel, rapid setups, entire departments operating at peak efficiency every single day without room for the kind of delays that most productions absorb as a matter of routine. Cities across America and Europe double for locations around the world, with clever production design allowing a single street to represent multiple countries through minimal but precise adjustments. The goal was global scope on a timeline that didn't technically allow for it, and the crew delivered. What's remarkable is how this frantic pace served the film's themes as well as its budget. Frank's life was defined by perpetual motion, always moving, always one step ahead of the people trying to catch him. By shooting so quickly and so restlessly across so many places, the filmmakers embedded that breathlessness into the movie's very fabric. The momentum audiences feel isn't just a result of clever editing. It's the residue of an actual production that never stopped moving. Tom Hanks, meanwhile, was navigating his own creative challenges in constructing the character of Carl Hannity, a character who, it should be noted, never actually existed. The dogged FBI agent who pursues Frank throughout the film is a fictional composite, drawn from multiple real law enforcement figures, but faithfully representing none of them. The actual agent most closely associated with Abagnale's eventual capture was a man named Joseph Shea, but screenwriter Jeff Nathanson had the freedom to create whoever the story needed rather than being bound to any real biography. This freedom allowed Hannity to be lonely, obsessive, unexpectedly sympathetic, traits that serve the narrative perfectly, but might not have matched any specific real person. Hanks brought additional authenticity to this invented character through an unexpected source. Spielberg had been watching court TV and noticed a particular attorney whose manner of speaking struck him as genuinely distinctive, unglamorous, slightly awkward, rooted in working-class reality in a way that Hollywood rarely captures. He shared the recording with Hanks, who used it not as a direct template, but as a foundation, a starting point for building Carl's voice from the ground up. The resulting character sounds like someone who actually exists, which is the highest compliment you can pay to a fictional person. Before Hanks inhabited that role, another actor had been attached to it, and imagining what that version of the film might have looked like is one of cinema's more tantalizing counterfactuals. James Gandolfini, at the peak of his cultural moment following his acclaimed work in The Sopranos, was originally cast as Hannity. His interpretation would almost certainly have been darker and more physically imposing, bringing a different kind of threat to the pursuit. Scheduling conflicts forced his departure before filming began, and the production pivoted to Hanks as a replacement. The casting change altered the film's entire emotional balance. Hanks brought warmth and a quality of gentle vulnerability to the role that made Hannity sympathetic in ways that changed how audiences experience the entire cat-and-mouse dynamic. Rather than a straightforward antagonist, Carl became something more complex. A mirror for Frank, a lonely man who finds in his relentless pursuit a kind of companionship he can't seem to find anywhere else. Gandolfini would surely have delivered something memorable. But the chemistry between Hanks and DiCaprio, that unlikely, unspoken affection between hunter and hunted, became one of the film's most enduring qualities. There's a hidden detail hidden in the film's most dramatic sequence that most viewers never catch, even on repeated viewings. When Frank is finally arrested in France, one of the police officers placing him in custody is the real Frank Abagnale. It's a blink-and-miss-it cameo, brief and wordless, easy to overlook entirely unless you already know to look for it. Spielberg included it as a playful acknowledgement of the man whose life, or whose version of his life, had inspired everything on screen. The layers of irony are considerable. The real con artist playing a law enforcement officer arresting his fictional counterpart, deceiving audiences one final time in a movie built entirely around the theme of deception. For viewers who discover it, the scene transforms from a tense narrative moment into something closer to a private joke, a knowing wink shared between filmmaker and subject at the audience's affectionate expense. The film's animated title sequence deserves its own moment of appreciation, not merely as an aesthetic achievement, but as a statement of intent. Before any actor appears, before any dialogue is spoken, those opening credits establish everything the film is going to be. Sophisticated, playful, slightly dangerous, and deeply in love with a particular era's idea of elegance. The sequence pays conscious tribute to Saul Bass, the legendary graphic designer whose revolutionary title work for films like Vertigo and North by Northwest had redefined what opening credits could accomplish. By channeling his aesthetic, Spielberg announced that this film understood its own cinematic heritage, that it intended to operate in a tradition of stylish, intelligent popular entertainment rather than gritty realism. Audiences who don't know Saul Bass by name still absorb what his influence creates: a mood, a period, an expectation. By the time Frank appears on screen, viewers have already been primed for something elegant and morally complicated. The titles aren't decoration. They're the film's first act of careful audience manipulation, which makes them entirely appropriate for a movie about the world's most gifted manipulator. The personal dimension of Spielberg's investment in this material is perhaps the most revealing secret of all, and the one that explains most completely why the film carries the emotional weight it does. His parents divorced when he was young, and the experience left marks on him that he has spoken about across decades of interviews. The confusion, the grief, the particular longing of a child caught between two worlds. When he encountered Frank Abagnale's story, he recognized something of his own experience in the young con artist's desperate need for his father's approval, his inability to stop running even when running was clearly destroying him, his loneliness beneath the glamour and performance and constant reinvention. The film's father-son story isn't just dramatically compelling. It's autobiographical in a way that audiences sense without being able to name. The authenticity of Spielberg's emotional investment shows in every frame of every scene between Frank and his father. It explains why those scenes land so much harder than the plot strictly requires them to. He wasn't telling someone else's story about a con artist. He was telling his own story about what it means to grow up too fast in a broken family. And the con artist just happened to be the vehicle he chose. What happened in the years after the film's release introduced an additional layer of complexity that Spielberg couldn't have anticipated. Journalists and investigators began examining Frank Abagnale's claims more carefully than anyone had bothered before, and what they found raised uncomfortable questions. Timelines didn't always align with verifiable records. Details that seemed specific and checkable often proved impossible to confirm through independent sources. Former prosecutors disputed the scope and duration of Abagnale's criminal activities. Some suggested that while his exploits were real, they were considerably more modest than the legend indicated. Others questioned whether certain events had happened in the manner he described at all. The possibility emerged that the greatest con Frank Abagnale ever pulled might have been the memoir itself, a life story so entertainingly constructed that nobody thought to check whether it was actually true until it had already become legend. Remarkably, none of this diminished the film's power in any lasting way. Spielberg had never been making a documentary. He'd been making mythology, and mythology doesn't require fact-checking to retain its meaning. The emotional content of the story rings true regardless of whether the specific events can be verified, which means the film succeeded on its own terms even as a foundation beneath it became increasingly uncertain. Frank Abagnale himself contributed to the film's creation in a way that was, appropriately enough, slightly paradoxical. He stayed completely away from production, No script consultations, no set visits, no input on how his life would be portrayed. His reasoning was clear-eyed and generous. He understood that his presence might constrain the storytelling, that writers and directors need the freedom to make difficult choices without worrying about offending the person who inspired them. By stepping back, he gave Spielberg's team permission to reimagine his life however the story required, to invent scenes that served the narrative even when they contradicted the facts, to create emotional truths even at the cost of biographical accuracy. The paradox is that his absence in production may have made the film more personally revealing about him than his presence would have allowed. When he finally watched the completed movie, his response was genuine appreciation, not for the factual accuracy it had never promised, but for the emotional truth it had somehow managed to capture. The loneliness, the longing for his father's love, the hollowness that lived beneath the performance. All of it rang true to him, even wrapped in circumstances that he knew the filmmakers had invented. The film understood him in ways that a strictly accurate account might have missed entirely. The Broadway musical adaptation that arrived in 2011 added yet another chapter to the story's remarkable journey across formats and generations. Translating cinematic storytelling to live performance is one of entertainment's most reliably treacherous undertakings, but this particular material proved unusually well-suited to the stage. Its period charm, its father-son emotional core, its inherent theatricality all mapped naturally onto the demands of musical theater. Songs replaced dialogue, choreography added energy, and the intimate family drama took on an even greater prominence than it had on screen. Multiple Tony Award nominations validated the creative team's approach to the adaptation, confirming that Frank Abagnale's legend had proven genuinely versatile, capable of filling theater seats as effectively as it filled movie theaters 9 years earlier. Stories about identity and reinvention apparently transcend their medium, finding new audiences in each new form they inhabit. And then there's the release itself, which should by any conventional logic have been a disaster. Opening a film 1 week after The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers had begun its conquest of the holiday box office. Seems like a decision made by people who had given up on commercial success before they'd even tried. Instead, the film found its audience precisely because it didn't compete with the competition. It offered something completely different to viewers who weren't interested in epic fantasy battles and wanted something sophisticated and adult instead. Word of mouth carried it beyond opening weekend. Repeat viewers returned with friends and family. The film never claimed the top box office spot, but it built a legacy that outlasted most number ones from that same holiday season by a considerable margin. Longevity, it turned out, mattered more than a single weekend's dominance. Catch Me If You Can endures for the same reason all genuinely great films endure, because it captures something true about human experience that doesn't expire when the cultural moment passes. It's a film about the stories we tell about ourselves, about the performances we put on for the world, and the longing beneath them that the performance is designed to conceal. It's about fathers and sons, about the particular ache of wanting approval from someone who can't quite give it to you in the form you need. It's about running, from pain, from consequences, from the terrifying possibility of stopping long enough to figure out who you actually are when nobody's watching. Spielberg made this film after more than 2 decades of waiting, because it was finally the right time for him to make it, because he had finally found a story that said what he needed to say. The 25 secrets hidden in its making don't diminish any of that. If anything, they make the film more remarkable. A reminder that the most extraordinary things are often built on improbable foundations by imperfect people, against considerable odds, through a combination of talent, timing, and the stubborn refusal to give up on a story worth telling.